Let me be honest with you. For the last 2 weeks, I have been figuratively and now literally burdened with the challenge of trying to encapsulate the breadth and depth of Ken Wilber's integral theory and integral psychology in just two 20-minute videos, and it has not been the success that I want it to be. I'm going to put these down. Surprisingly, I was wondering why holding those books up was so tiring, and actually got a set of weighing scales out, and it's 10 kilograms worth of paper. Just ridiculous. And embarrassingly for me, because I was training Muay Thai yesterday, very sore in my chest, so it was like a nice chest compression. Regardless, this is my way of avoiding the fact that I have failed to encapsulate the depth and breadth of integral theory to the degree that I wanted to, and nonetheless I'm going to make this video as immediate and relevant for you and your inquiry into integral theory, which I still believe to be the top tier of consciousness studies out there. I'm going to focus on two main aspects of Ken Wilber's work: the holonic nature of consciousness. This is the gradations of wholes and parts, which I'll walk you through, in addition to the step-by-step, more or less practical way of going from one level of consciousness to another level of consciousness without repressing what came before and leaving ourselves open to unconscious shadow attacks or unexpected regressions or possessions even, which might cause damage to ourselves or other people as we try to accelerate ourselves a little bit too quickly. So, where do we start? Well, I would argue that we should start with this book, Ken Wilber's A Brief History of Everything. This is a very interesting book by Wilber because he wrote it in the Socratic style, so it's a dialogue. It actually goes backwards and forwards between Ken Wilber and one of the interviewers, the fictional interviewer. It's really Ken Wilber talking with himself. And he introduces this idea of basically the sum of hundreds, literally hundreds of different developmental studies, which he later charted in integral psychology. Actually, might have been before, in these wonderful series of psychographs. Look at this. It's dozens, literally dozens of different developmental psychologies, both child psychology, spiritual theories, different theories of moral development, into what is ultimately, back to our main book, a theory of everything. So, what should you do to understand this? Well, you read this book. If you haven't got time to read this book, then this video is probably not for you, because I really am trying to share what I believe to be one of the most fascinating views of consciousness. I'm going to give you a metaphor to explain it. By Ken Wilber's theory, we've got 7 easily discernible stages: the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the modern, the postmodern, the integral, and the super-integral, which I've put all the way up here because we're not really seeing that just yet. That is truly an enlightenment state. Most of us are around the modern, postmodern, emerging integral stage, but this is all still far too abstract and arguably irrelevant for most people, even someone like yourself who's more interested in this esoteric kind of stuff. What does it mean to actually have a hierarchy of consciousness? Well, most people, when they think of the word hierarchy, especially in today's climate of combative kind of interplay around that word, especially when it comes to gender and power, think that this means a dominator hierarchy. We make this implicit assumption that hierarchy means power over, rather than a natural ordering. And this is where we get into the core idea of what Ken Wilber believes to be that ladder or spiral of development. It's about the holonic consciousness. A holon is a whole in itself, but a part in something else. For example, if I were to pick out a random extract from this book, here we go. Ken Wilber here. This is roughly what Piaget called concrete operational cognition, which emerges around age 6 to 7 on average. That is a sentence. That is a holon. But each word is a holon, and each letter is a holon. A whole is a complete thing in itself, and yet a part of something greater. A letter is a part of a word, is a part of a sentence, is a part of a paragraph, of a chapter, of a book, of a collection, of a library, so on and so forth. When it comes to a human being, we are structured holonically or hierarchically in the same way. We have a human, we have organs, we have different tissue structures or muscle structures, and inside of that we have different cells and different atoms, and then going upwards, we have a human who's part of a family, who's part of a culture, who's part of a collective known as humanity. This is what it means to structure the archaic, magic, mythic, modern, postmodern integral within that visualization of circles. Circles on circles on circles on circles, ever expanding. That is the core idea of any system of consciousness. It's the idea that the lesser is included in the greater, and that if we truly want to integrate, especially when it comes to shadow material, then we need to be willing and capable, and also, I suppose, constantly vigilant of how we can integrate those lower states within a higher degree of general operation, a center of gravity, if you will. I'll give you a practical example. You might be familiar, in fact, you almost certainly are familiar with the phrase modern and postmodern. So in the modernist stage of consciousness, we could roughly relate it to around the rejection of old-style Christianity, the medieval style of Christianity, which is the mythic consciousness, around the 1600s, the Enlightenment era, the Renaissance era. That's coming through as a modernist stance. And then postmodernism, that's coming through in the 20th century, which rejects things like the objective view of the world, where there is a right answer, and says no, things are subjective, things are open to interpretation, things are even constructed. Perhaps a postmodern view would even say, in rejection of the modernist view, men and women are merely social constructs. The idea of gender is a social construct. I'm completely misrepresenting a whole field of nuanced study there, but I hope you see what I'm saying. You've got modernism, which then forms a foundation, a whole in itself, or a whole in itself, like a sentence inside of a paragraph, which postmodernism needs to exist, but also transcends. That's the idea at the very core of integral theory, of integral consciousness. There are many ways to map this. You can have an internal dimension and an external dimension, an individual dimension and a collective dimension. This is Ken Wilber's 4-quadrant model. Again, I highly recommend you start with reading this book yourself. It really is a very good book, top 10 book in the library. Well, not necessarily, actually. When we get to episode 50 in this series, we're going to be covering this bad boy, Religion of Tomorrow, which is definitely top 10. This is more of the little brother of Religion of Tomorrow. So what does all this theory mean in regards to your life today? Well, if you're interested in accessing unconscious material, and if you're also interested in dealing with the darker, shadowy elements within that unconscious, you're likely already also interested in the golden shadow higher potential. And for you to understand properly and integrate properly at both that level before and that level to be, which you're aiming towards, which you're seeking out and trying to bring down, you need to have an accurate idea of where your center of gravity is. For most people watching this video, it's going to be around postmodern, if not with elements of integral, or actually properly seated in integral consciousness, which in a nutshell means an ability to hold the tension of many paradoxical or dualistic dichotomies with a sense of detachment and also reverence for the truth of both positions. This would be the equivalent of taking left and right, masculine and feminine, night and day, so on and so forth, and finding the truth which binds. Getting a bit abstract here, getting a bit heady. What I want to make this video about in this moment is not more theory. It even takes my energy way up into my head in itself, and I'm actively trying to bring it down, which some would say is a somatic integral practice. What we need to learn how to do, and what I'm not doing so well in this exact moment, is how to transcend and include rather than transcend and repress. Or even worse, this is something that spiritual bypassers do, transcend and dissociate. This is what you see when you see anyone perhaps rejecting all of modernity or all of capitalism or all of the obvious things that are completely in front of them, using an iPhone, using a MacBook, using the plumbing and the heating, and still thinking that they are free of the system. They don't realize that that level of consciousness is built upon the previous stage of development collectively of that society. The problem with the hierarchy, or the problem with the way hierarchy is presented in more of the mainstream narrative right now, is that we're narrowing in on what that word means when it expresses through dysfunction. We're looking at dominator hierarchies. The typical arguments are around white men who are in power at the top of a hierarchy or the top of a corporate hierarchy. And the reality is that for most men who are in those positions, some of them actually are very healthy. Some of them are very integral. Some of them have world-giving kind of impetus inside of them, healthy king energy. But the ones that show up on the news or the stories that come up here and there are showing what happens when masculine urge for order becomes a hierarchical domination of every level below and a rejection of anything that might be above or parallel. This is where you might see something like a very vigorously motivated vegan or carnivore, or maybe like the alpha leader in that space, maybe some celebrity carnivore or some celebrity vegan, and they can be in that conflict cycle where they develop a loyal fan base beneath them, people kind of gravitate around them, and really they just represent a certain constellation of consciousness which attracts similar people of the same level of consciousness. This is still weaving around in the depths of integral psychology, but what I want you to try and grasp, or hopefully what I'm trying to invite your attention towards, is what would it mean to walk between those two dualities? Or perhaps if, say, you've gone through a vegan stage, or you're in a vegan stage, or you're in a carnivore stage, or whatever diet it may be, to recognize how in your own journey you've had different, complete worldviews, which sometimes then spiral back on themselves. Some people might go vegetarian, and then go carnivore, and then go vegetarian again. You think, how does this work? Well, this is where the spheres don't necessarily work, and we have to adopt more of a spiral dynamics view. And we see how it's Hegel's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We're going from something like veganism to carnivore, back to veganism, but with a new perspective. And then eventually most people will actually exist somewhere in that middle ground. But generally, when it comes to the internet, we only see the extremes. The vast majority go in the middle. And also in terms of integral consciousness, there's always going to be more of the lesser. There's always going to be more people across the world who are in modernist consciousness than super integral consciousness, because to get to super integral consciousness, that's 0.1%, if that. Integral consciousness, by some theories, is anywhere between 2 to 8% of the worldwide population at this point. Again, if you want to know all of the values of integral consciousness, or even any other stage of consciousness, I highly recommend you read these books for yourself. I'm merely trying to whet your appetite, trying to give you a taste for what it might be to see this from a new angle, to see that emotional experience, maybe something like a David Hawkins, levels of consciousness, with a truly developmental, rigorous academic backing behind it. I've definitely rambled in this video. I definitely have not represented the depth and breadth of integral psychology in the way that I wanted to, but alas, I spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to do this, and I can't do this, at least not in the way that I'd want to do, just yet. I recognize my limitations. I recognize my yet-to-be-birthed capacity to lecture fluidly for an hour or more about the half a dozen or so key concepts in integral theory, and what I'm instead trying to do, just open up your interest, open up a bit of engagement and curiosity, maybe hold this up for the 3rd time in a row, because subliminally 3 is a magic number. Brief History of Everything by Ken Wilber. I guarantee that this is the moment when people put this in their Amazon wish list, because that's just how it works. Cool psychology hack right there. I can make that a YouTube video. We're going to leave it here. But we're going to go straight into the next video, which will be even more practical and more applicable than this overview, just survey the territory. We're going to be looking at the different types of intelligence and consciousness as they concretize in your experience. We're going to look at IQ, EQ, and VQ. If you don't know what VQ is and you want to learn more about it, next video in Inner Work Essentials, we're going to learn about that and a whole lot more. I'll see you over there.